Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this fascinating session. So that's certainly like a short version of Colum's bio. So Colum's the author of more than 7 books, of 7 novels, as well as 3 collection of short stories. He also has received many awards and prizes, including the National Book Award for his first book, the Dublin Literary Prize, as well as the Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres from the French government. His native is, fittingly is Dublin, Ireland, the land of great writers. And he now lives in New York with his wife and 3 children. Welcome, Colum, and looking forward.
Thank you so much.
So I thought we'll start, with so Colum's most recent book is called a Paragon, and I must confess I had to Google the meaning of it, and it means like a shape which has countably infinite sides. So first, tell us a little bit about that title, like why you decided to use it, and what it means to you, to the book.
I think everyone should direct their attention at my wonderful publisher and editor, Alexandra Pringle, and see her smile.
Oh, okay.
There she is. She's amazing, by the way. But see her smile. That's a hell of a smile, first of all. But secondly, because the issue of the title came up a couple of times, look. As we talked about, and we got to be honest about this, it's the worst title for a book in the short term, I think, because nobody knows what it is, and it's hard to fathom. But in the long term, it's a word that if you get through the book and if you perhaps like the book, it's a word that sort of becomes you in certain ways. So. I stumbled upon the word when I was writing about Northern Ireland, and the possibility of there being so much more than 2 sides. We're talking today about empathy, and we're going to be talking about the idea of stepping into another space. But there's so much more than 2 sides. So I was interested in these polygons that you come upon, decagons and hectagons and all these things. And at the obscure end of all of this, I found this word. A paragon, and I tucked it into my back pocket, thinking one day I wanted to use it, and it became the actual title of the novel right from the very beginning. But all of my publishers, including my publishers in the States, asked me to change it, and I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't. And they were probably right at the same time. So there's a couple of truths going on here, at all at once. For me, it relates to a certain facet of how we can deal with the truth. There's so much more than one truth, and the ability to hold complicated ideas in the palm of your hands at the exact same time is probably the essence of who we should be, especially because we are living right now in a time that seems increasingly diseased with certainty. Mm-hmm. You have one idea, and that's the only idea that you have and can be. And I think we're so much more than that.
And the book is based on true events, right? So there was a choice for you to use like a novel to explore it, or a non-fiction. So you've chosen a novel. Like what was behind that? Like why did you choose to explore like a true incident through a novel?
I think this is possibly one of the burning questions in terms of literary questions at this particular time. What's true, what's not true, what's fake, and who can trust what's actually true. So, to give you a background to the novel, I've written. This was my 7th novel. I've written about all sorts of things. I wrote about 9/11 in New York. I lived with the homeless people in New York, in the subway tunnels of New York, on and off, for about a year and a half, many years ago. I've written about the Russian dancer Rudolf Nureyev. I've done many different things. I've written about Northern Ireland. I went to the West Bank, and I went to Israel about 6 years ago, and I went on a tour with a non-profit agency that I work with and co-founded, in fact, called Narrative Form, and a group of artists, musicians, writers, activists. We all got together and we took this bus tour around the West Bank and around Israel, and my heart was blown open. It's like you get your rib cage yanked sideways, and the people would reach in and turn your heart backwards with the stories that they told. But on the second to the last day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on a rainy November, I went into this little set of flats, really, that had been turned into offices in a town called Beit Jala, which many of you know is on the edge of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And there were two men sitting at a long wooden table there, and just ordinary men, Rami and Bassam. But within half an hour, I'm sort of not ashamed to tell you that I was in tears having listened to their stories. They both lost their daughters in separate incidents, and they spent their lives now trying to turn their grief into some sort of understanding. And they go around the world telling their stories, not to be didactic or anything like that, but to make people feel what it felt. And what it did to me is what I suppose good literature should do, is it should make you feel. It shouldn't tell you what it is that you need to know, but it should allow you to dwell in that space, to catch the pulse of the moment, if you will. And so I went away, and I'm Irish. I'm a white male. I live in New York, middle-aged, and I went back to New York, and I thought, well, what would I like to write about? And I thought, well, I can't really do that. That's not my territory. But I kept coming back to it over and over and over again. I think writers write towards their obsessions, and I knew that I had to at least try to write this book. I didn't know what it was going to be. Was it going to be nonfiction, or was it going to be fiction? And in the end, it's called a novel. But one of the things that interests me is, like, what is fiction, and what is nonfiction? And surely nonfiction is as shaped and interpreted as fiction happens to be. And maybe in the end, it all comes down to storytelling, and that sort of storytelling which sort of jags you awake, or does what Rami and Bassam had done to me, was turn my life inside out by telling it. And so I approach this story in the same way that, so for example, the characters in the book are very real, and hopefully they come across as real, but it is called a novel. And I'll just tell you two of the incidents where I actually call it a novel. Rami, who's the Israeli, he drives a motorbike, and he drives it very fast. Now, if you went to Jerusalem today and you got on the back of Rami's motorbike, he would drive you through Jerusalem, and he would be this elderly fast driver of a motorbike. I got on a motorbike. I used to drive a motorbike myself, but I wanted the reader to be on the motorbike. The problem with Rami's motorbike was that it was an automatic.
Okay.
Right? And on the page, an automatic doesn't do as much to the reader as what a gear does, or what a clutch does, or revving the engine in particular ways. And so the way the words operate on the page has the reader upon the motorbike. That's using elements of fiction. The second one that I'll just give you an idea of is Bassam went on hunger strike for 17 days. Bassam is the Palestinian. He was in prison for 7 years. During his prison term, he was on hunger strike for 17 days, and he broke his fast when he got some concessions. In the novel, I have him break the fast with a mint that he steals from the warden's desk. The line is, the taste of the mint, the taste was alarmingly minty, or something like that, because I want the reader to feel the surprise of the sentence, and to be engaged with the moment when he ends the hunger strike. So this is what I think fiction can do, the two men are still amongst my best friends. They know that the story is entirely truthful, even though certain parts of it, small parts of it, textural parts of it, are made up. But they're made up in order to find a deeper, if you will, non-fictional truth.
Right. But the essence has kind of stayed of the story, and that's
Yes, yes.
okay. Sounds good. And like, they went through like a massive personal crisis, a big trauma, and as part of their organization, as well as for the book, it requires them to tell that story, over and over.
Right.
So, do you feel like that retelling shackles a person more in his grief, or at some level lets it go?
No, that's a good question. And the answer is I don't know, which is probably maybe becoming more and more part of my lexicon and admitting to the fact that we don't know is a powerful thing. But I do know this, that the day they told me the story, I thought they were only telling it for the very first time.
Okay.
I felt, because I was hearing it, and I was hearing it as if it had been done for the very first time. The truth was that they had told it already 2 times that day, and they'd told it thousands of times in the years previously. But John Berger, another great author who Alexander published, John Berger says, never again will a single story be told as if it were the only one. And one of the things that we have to do, both as writers and within our cultures, is to tell the story over and over again, because once is never quite enough. I was at a spectacular talk about the partition just about earlier today, and just hearing those stories and the need for us to tell these stories over and over again is sort of overwhelming.
Okay, sounds good. So, your first book, which won the National Book Award, and it was an incredible read. Let the great world spin. You have this character there called Corrigan, and then the story of Rami and Bassam as well. What I see across your books is very empathetic characters. So is the reason for that, like the protagonist being so empathetic, that you want to nudge or you want to suggest to the reader to kind of think in those terms, or did those characters come about just in service of the story? Sorry, long question.
Ooh, I think the only things worth doing are the things that might potentially break your heart, right? The only things worth doing are the things that might be inexecutable in certain ways. So in terms of storytelling, you go to the deepest, furthest part of where the story will take you. You don't always know what it is or how you're going to get there. The big lie, especially at festivals like this, is that writers know what they're doing. We don't. Certainly I don't. Okay, I can't speak for. That's the other thing. You can't speak for all writers. You can't speak for. There are literally they're part of the Paragon, but most of the time I don't know what I'm doing. But I hope I'm going to get somewhere that I recognize. Wow, that I went on that journey, and it's a little pretentious, so forgive me, but I think it's important that Dostoevsky has a really interesting quote that he says that to be too acutely conscious is to be diseased. So in other words, when you overthink something, you can bring an illness to your work. I've been there, and people talk about the unexamined life not being worth living, but also the over-examined life might not be worth living as well. But I will say, in relation to trying to get into these characters who are, I suppose, deeply empathetic, is because I would like to be like them. I'm not, but part of my job is to look at these people, men, women, who are doing extraordinary things in the world, and try to let other people dwell inside their stories, so that we can disrupt the world a little bit, and not make it quite as simple as certain people want it to be.
Okay. So, like one of the characters, like Corrigan, for example, like did you know in the what I found interesting was that he was the main character for the book for the first 100 pages or so, 120 pages, and then and then he suddenly dies. Sorry if to
Spoiler
make
alert.
And I was, yeah, it was a very like surprising moment. Like I almost wanted to ask the medics to, one more time check his pulse, and he can't die. He's like the empathetic protagonist who's supposed to last the book. So like was that something that kind of came up as you wrote the book, or?
Yeah, he died on me, and I was like, shit. This is not supposed to happen. This is what not supposed. And he was in a hospital. He was in a there's a crash, and I'm like, no, I can't do this like straight away. But then the further I got into it, I realized that the whole novel was about the recreation of this person through other people's points of view. It sort of became that kaleidoscopic John Berger thing, that you start to see it from other angles, and that the interesting thing about killing a character, your main character off in the first 100 pages is that the story becomes kind of about storytelling, because death will take away a lot of things. It'll take away your house, your country, your border. Can take away your loved ones, but it will never take away your stories. And so for me, that was one of the most powerful things. Understanding that one of the things that we all will inevitably leave behind is the stories that surround us, and that therefore we need to tell them as powerfully and as honestly as possible. But also we need to explore the stories beyond ourselves, because it's not like a solipsistic universe that you want to just dwell inside. You want to. I think other people are much more interesting than we ourselves are. I mean, I wake up in the morning, I'm pretty happy when I look in the mirror to know that I'm not going to be spending the next 24 hours only with myself. That's why I love fiction in certain ways. The ability to sort of to see. Oh, I just got visited by a leaf. To see what it is that I might know. One of the things that I've often said to students of literature is that you don't write what you know. If you write what you know, you're sort of limited. What you have to do is write what you don't know.
And that's like different from a lot of writing advice that's given on writing what you know,
Right.
especially like early on for a while.
Right. Well, the thing is, the people who say that you write what you know, they're entirely correct. Because logically, philosophically, the only thing that you can write is what you actually know. Yeah. But if you write towards what you want to know, you discover things that you knew but you weren't entirely aware of. So you're accessing different parts of yourself. It's like an empathetic leap, even into yourself. Like people ask, what is empathy? And that's one of our questions for today. We were talking about it earlier. Yeah. Like, what is empathy? Is it the ability to leap into, somebody else's shoes? I don't really think so. I think it's accessing a part of your own soul that has a kinship with the soul of someone else. It's almost like an act of kindness unto yourself. It's not, and it's also not some sort of thing that's up there, kumbaya in the air. These things are dangerous as well. Stories can be dangerous, and accessing and having empathy for other people's situations can be a sort of powerful political act as much as anything else.
Yeah, but I was fascinated by a word you used, projection. So, but when you say projection, doesn't it kind of take you away a little bit from, let's say, reality? And when you kind of, if it's something that you're projecting from yourself in a way, does it take away the objective view of a situation, or is it more about just seeing it from another person's perspective?
I don't know. Again, honestly, I don't know. I will tell you this. We work with this organization, Narrative 4, and we bring kids together from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we do, for example, is we bring kids from the South Bronx together with kids from Eastern Kentucky. They couldn't be further apart. I'm sure there are equivalents here, even within this region that you can imagine. I know for certain there are equivalents within India that you can imagine. But anyway, the kids from the South Bronx are primarily black. They're primarily and/or immigrant, right? They're urban, and they come from what's called a blue state. They're generally Democratic Party leaning. The kids from Eastern Kentucky, they come from Trump country. They're rural. They're mostly white and/or Cherokee, and the common denominator is that they're both poor. But guess what? They're terrified of one another. Yeah. They're completely terrified of one another. They get into a room, and the only way to properly negotiate the space between them and the differences between them is not storytelling, because storytelling can be bland and silly and didactic, but for them to tell a personal story to one another. And then we ask them to tell the story back. So we would be, if we were together and we were to tell one another's story, I would get back to the table and I would say, "Hi, my name is Pooja. And when I was 8 years old, I did this." Now, in doing that, in making that radical leap of empathy, two things happen. You learn to listen, and you also learn to tell somebody else's story, but you also give somebody your own story to take care of and to hold. And sometimes they butcher it, and sometimes they get it wrong, which is okay too. So all of this, movement is to really say that the world is a bigger place than what we immediately inhabit. Because I think the problem, as I said earlier, the problem of our times is that we're coming indoors, we're shutting the curtains, and we're saying, you can come in if you look like me, or you can come in if you sound like me, or you can come in if you vote like me. But what we really must do as writers and as thinkers, we must disrupt that sort of thing. And so with Narrative 4, that's what we do.
Okay, sounds good. And like, what's fascinating is, like, clearly as a writer, you're at the peak of your powers, if I may say that. But it's a very generous space to kind of you teach writing. You're involved with Narrative 4. There was a book that you wrote a few years ago, which was Letters to a Young Writer. So that generosity, like, is that something you saw growing up, or like, where does that come from?
I don't know. I mean, I like seeing people telling their stories. I like inhabiting new spaces. I like people who sort of jag my mind awake or my soul awake in the, and I suppose if you knew exactly where it came from, you'd be too aware of it and you wouldn't be able to really access it anymore. So here's the other thing about writing is that every time you finish a book, you're convinced that you'll never be able to do it again. Or that everybody will say, he's a charlatan, we caught him out now. Like my wife Alison, who's right here, she knows. She has to live with every book that I write. And every time I write something, halfway through I'll just say, I'm done, I'm finished. I have to give it up, and I'm actually in that process right now. So
sounds good. Like, one of the motives that you've used in the book, and since reading it, I find myself noticing birds more than I did before, and it's like across the book you use that motive. Like, what does it what does it mean for you, or within the story? Like, how did, as a device, why did you use it?
So I knew nothing about ornithology or birds or anything like that, but when I went to write a Paragon, I went to the West Bank. I was staying in Beit Jala. I saw, as I was going past in a taxi, a sign for this place called a bird ringing center. Okay. I was like, what the hell is a bird ringing center? I mean, it's like, thinking like they're wringing their necks or whatever. I had no idea. And so I went and I Googled it, and I found out there was bird banding. Then I became really fascinated. So they capture birds in these mist nets on the hills in the West Bank, and then they put a tag on them. Then I found out there was another bird banding section just across the wall in Jerusalem, and these birds were being made into sort of Israeli birds and Palestinian birds. And I thought, wow, this is sort of crazy, because this is on the second busiest superhighway of birds in the entire world. And there are billions of birds literally that fly over Israel and Palestine. So birds are coming from South Africa and going over this place. They're also coming from Ireland and from Sweden. And then I began to think, well, maybe we're all birds, and maybe we all sort of like fly over Jerusalem in one respect and one time or another. And then the more I read about birds, the more fabulous they became.
Have you heard that like a lot of writers are bird watchers, or?
I believe some writers are bird watchers. Maybe, I don't know. It's part of our soul. Maybe we just want to fly away and go somewhere else. But there are a number of writers who are bird watchers. Yeah, but I'm not a bird watcher. I was just like fascinated by the poetry of it, to be honest with you. I wanted it to come off the page, like frigate birds, the way they're imitated, like people who make drones have studied the flight patterns of frigate birds and how they descend, and it's really quite extraordinary, and it just fit into this whole structure of the book. The book is told in 1,001 different chapters, which is kind of crazy. But the reason it's told in 1,001 chapters was because about 2 years into writing it, still not knowing how it was going to turn out, or even who was narrating it, I was with Rami and Bassam, and I realized, holy shit, the reason they're telling the stories of their daughters, of their late daughters, is because they want to keep them alive. Who else does that? Well, it's a Scheherazade moment. And then I realized, okay, this fractured novel, which was going to be in 100 chapters, now has to be in 1,001 chapters. And that's the sort of accident that I'm saying, that the writers don't necessarily know that they're going to do that. If you knew that you were going to do that beforehand, you'd be some sort of peculiar, person. But when you discover it as you go along, and a lot of this stuff is about stamina, desire, and perseverance. And do you have the ability to sit at your typewriter or computer or whatever it happens to be and fight the silence as much as you can, so that one of these moments will come along and hit you? Like so you're a novelist too, right? So do you feel the same way?
Yeah, and one thing that you said which resonated was, how thank you.
Buy it.
Was that how when you kind of start on something new, it's really like starting completely afresh, not knowing whether you could do it.
Terrified,
again.
right?
Yeah. And I mean that kind of shows that it's a new journey every time, and
right.
There's some, like, let's say you have to kind of tap into something that you didn't know you had.
Right.
And if you.
But that's the beauty of it then too, sometimes, because if you are not writing what you supposedly know, it's almost like going to university again, those 4 years that you're going to go to, and you explore this new subject, and it opens the whole world for you in certain ways. So I think writers, there's a lot of talk about writers reinventing themselves and doing all these things. I suppose writers are constantly reinventing themselves as long as they're daring to do something new. Like I love the expression by Samuel Beckett: no matter, try again, fail better. And I think that writers, especially the younger writers who are out here, and who they should be prepared to, Vonnegut says we should be continually jumping off of cliffs and developing our wings on the way down. Which is gorgeous, right? Yeah, that's kind of what you do. You jump off the cliff, and you hope to God you're going to have a wings on the way down.
Have you found yourself flapping with just one wing sometimes?
Yeah, I just crashed. So yeah. No, the beauty of writing too is that you can crash and get up. It's not like, so when I wrote about Philippe Petit, the tightrope walker who walked across the World Trade Center towers, I mean, if he fell, he fell. You know, he wasn't getting up. And he was also creating art as well, which is really beautiful. Like everybody, some people think of it only as a tightrope walk, but for me, when I go back down to the World Trade Center towers in New York, I live in New York these days, and I look up into the sky, I don't see that quote-unquote Freedom Tower. I still see Philippe Petit on a little wire, like a little flyman in the air, and what he has done by doing this thing is he has enshrined it in a sort of imaginative history that's impossible to deny and becomes part of our memory. And these stories and storytelling that we talk about, these are the things that legislate us right until the end. And what he did was he dared himself. And then this is another thing that I'd say to the younger writers out here, that you have to risk yourself. You have to dare. You have to sometimes risk embarrassment, risk sentiment, risk all of these different things to try and tell the best possible story that you can.
Yeah. And like Philippe Petit, like he finds his way back into this book, like that part is like really beautifully written, and also like he had an unexpected bird visitor as well. And as soon as I read that, I kind of Googled and went back and saw whether that really happened, and it was amazing that it did, and it kind of...
Yeah, the funny thing about this book is that people read it and they Google a lot of it, and nearly 99% of the time the stuff that they Google is correct, so that they don't believe the stuff that is, you know, sort of outrageous, but then the stuff that I made up, they sort of accept as kind of true. And I was doing that on purpose, because the book is trying to question, you know, what is real, and who, you know, is the imagined real? Well, I kind of think it is. You know, for me, reading, say, Ulysses, it is an imagined work, of course, but my grandfather was alive in June 16, 1904, and his father was actually the same age as Leopold Bloom would have been walking the streets of Dublin in that novel. So the thing is, I get to read that novel and I begin to understand my grandfather and my great-grandfather in a much more profound way, so that the imagined actually becomes real. And then also, the thing about this also is that the real is also imagined. And so we're living in this time where we're dealing with all these issues, and it's sort of the job of the artist to to throw things out there in the mix, and so that we begin to ask ourselves these questions, and then we question the systems that are done. We question the political systems that are around us, and I actually have hope that we can somehow harness our technology and in some sort of emergent fashion for young people to start a new sort of political spectrum based on the notion that all of these stories are available to us.
And it kind of takes me to another question that I thought we'd discuss is like with everything else going on in the world, I had a session yesterday with John Kay, for example, and there's border disputes, there's climate change, there's avalanches every other day. So there's many things going on in the world, and human conflict is probably the one constant over the decades. So, like, personally, does that make you a cynic a little bit deep down, or how do you, like, especially going through the process of writing the book?
Yeah, this is interesting territory for me. I mean, if you want to piss off a cynic, I kind of do. I love pissing off the cynics. You just call them sentimental. because they go nuts because they think because you might display some form of optimism that you're somehow being sentimental. But cynics live in the sort of cloud of their own understanding. They refuse to journey outside of their own understanding. They've set limits on themselves. They don't travel in any way. Whereas I think the optimist travels in certain ways, or is prepared to risk themselves in ways that I talked about earlier. And I like the notion that of the Italian social scientist Antonio Gramsci, I think that's how it's pronounced, but he talks about being a pessimist of reality and an optimist of the will. In other words, the world is dark, but so what? You have to will yourself away from that. Everyone knows that that's the truth. Yes, there are all these terrible things that are going on, and then so what? How are we going to negotiate it and change it?
So it almost sounds like a cynic is somebody who does not, who kind of, it's like a full stop and he doesn't take the next step almost, right?
A cynic is limited, I think, yeah. So the optimist sort of terrifies them in certain ways. So they want to take you into a corner and pretend that you're like sort of sentimental. But I think the rage that you have to be an optimist, especially nowadays, to believe that you can change things in some sort of small way, that's the sort of rage that's needed. And I think it really happens in our schools, but for me, that's where a lot of the stuff can happen.
Okay, tell us a little bit more about narrative 4, like the genesis of the idea, and like some of those techniques that you spoke about. Like how did you kind of know that that's the way to go?
Well, this was started literally 10 years ago by a group of writers and artists led by this woman by the name of Lisa Consiglio, who's now the CEO of the whole organization. We're in 21 different countries. We're not in India, not yet, maybe sometime soon. And they recognize that the power of stories and storytelling, and also how young people can be led towards action through the act and art of storytelling. I mean, it's really amazing what's happened in these little communities where we have young people talking to one another, trying to understand one another, and then they come up with schemes to change their own environment. For example, just very quickly, South Africa. We went into Port Elizabeth. There's a place called Joe Slovo Township. We got all these young people together. They started telling stories to one another. Part of what they recognized in their stories was that there was a lack of a recycling facility in the area, and a lot of the kids were getting sick because there was certain health issues that were going on. They decided to start a recycling program that's called a trash to treasure program, where they brought in all the plastic and they've now started a whole program whereby you bring in bags of plastic and you get food in exchange for it, not money, because the money would be drunk away by the parents, right? And or shot away, like the big drug use that was going on. And so these young people came up with these solutions, and there's now a whole center in Joe Slovo Township where the whole community is sort of transformed because it came from the ground up. And that's the only interesting way for things to happen. Because for centuries we've been pushing down, and power has been pushing down in all sorts of ways. But when the power when it gets reversed, I think that's when things really start to happen.
And which year did you start?
We only started that 2 years ago. But we started Narrative 4 10 years ago. Literally 10 years ago, like sort of this month. So we're doing our 10th anniversary. And there's all sorts of artists that are involved with us. Terry Tempest Williams, Marlon James, Salman Rushdie, Sting, the musician. And so we link artists with young people, with teachers. But the teachers are the real heroes as far as I'm concerned. They're the ones who have the gateway to this sort of democratic instinct of storytelling, because they're on the ground working with these young people. And so we go into schools and they bring young people together to exchange these stories, and it's wild. It's really fantastic what happens.
And how old are the
Generally, we work with 16 to 18-year-olds, but we also can work with any age. I mean, we could do a narrative exchange here now. We could all find somebody who we don't know and tell them a little story about something perhaps that we're wearing, or something that we're holding, or something that we're thinking. And you'd be shocked what it does to you. Okay, when we tell a story, the brain is on fire, right? It's a big, colorful circus. But when we tell somebody else's story, the brain is like a dozen carnivals going all at once. They've mapped out the brain and what happens when you're telling somebody else's story. What part of you it's accessing, and it's really quite tremendous. And this is the basis of this sort of empathetic engagement. And this is also where literature, poetry, theatre, novels, short stories is profoundly important, because it becomes a sort of act of empathetic engagement. The act of reading in itself is a thing where we trust that the writer will take us to some place that we can learn something about ourselves.
Sounds good. Do you have any other questions, or we can open it up to?
I'm happy to open it up to questions, for sure.
Any questions? Yeah. Maybe.
Hi, so since we were talking about empathy, I was wondering if you could share with us something from your life, perhaps a story, where you have had to bring about your sense of empathy with an imagined other, or challenge your idea of the other and bring empathy about.
Sure, I've got millions of them. They possibly happen, every single day, in these quiet moments and also these larger moments. But I mentioned earlier that I got to know the homeless people in the subway tunnels of New York for a book that I wrote in the 1990s. It's called This Side of Brightness. But I remember one day being down the tunnels, and I'd been traveling, and I had these little sachets, these airplane sachets. I didn't pretend to be homeless. I wasn't like trying to pretend. Everybody knew that I was coming in, talking to them as a reporter or a journalist. But I had these little airplane sachets, and I gave one to this woman by the name of Doreen, and she loved it, right? She was so happy, and she used it, and she cleaned her hands, and I saw how happy she was. And the next time I was down the tunnels there under Riverside Park in New York, I bought a couple of these things, and she was so happy. And then I said, okay, this is great. I'm going to go to the shops, and I'm going to buy a container of these. But the only container I could find was a container of baby wipes, which are essentially the same thing, right? So I brought down this container of baby wipes, and she started to cry. And I was like, what in the world is going on? And then I thought, I've just insulted her by giving her a huge container of these things. But also, maybe deep behind all of this, there's some baby that's involved. There's some story of a baby, and I had to sort of try to imagine, what it was like to be her in that particular situation, with this person coming along, giving her this gift that was completely sort of inappropriate. But I mean, I think that these things happen to us virtually every single moment of the day, if we have our eyes open.
But did you find out why she was upset? This is so curious.
No, I didn't find out, because I didn't want to ask her, and I just didn't think it was appropriate at that particular time. But sometimes the mystery is better than anything else, right? Mystery joins us together, right? That's the thing. The unsaid, and that's the beauty about writing too. What's unsaid is sometimes so much more powerful than what's actually said. Thank you.